Well, I'm pleased to be here tonight to talk to you about Heilkunst and homeopathy. I was asked to make a presentation in general on this topic, and what I've done is prepared a fairly basic presentation, which you can download later, so that you can get a sense of the topic that we're talking about. What is effectively the difference or similarities between Heilkunst and homeopathy? These are terms that are thrown around a lot and not necessarily well understood. So I hope I can clarify that this evening and keep the formal presentation fairly short so that afterwards at the end we can have various questions that occur to you on this topic or almost anything to do with Heilkunst or homeopathy. You can type in the questions in the chat bar and I'll just address them and we'll just go from there. So the terms homeopathy and Heilkunst are known to some of you. At least certainly homeopathy is in general sense. Heilkunst is something that is much more recent and is something that people who have had something to do with our clinic or our college are familiar with. But as this term gets out there in the general public to a greater degree, there's a certain amount of confusion as to exactly what the relationship is between homeopathy and Heilkunst. So hopefully we can clarify that. So I'm just going to start with the three basic questions we're dealing with here. Is first of all, what exactly is homeopathy? We use that word a lot, but it's used in many different ways and has different meanings to different people. So we need to clarify, at least at a basic level, what exactly do we mean by homeopathy? And then at the same time, what is Heilkunst? And then what is the difference or how do they relate? To tackle that, I wanted to just start with three basic cases, try to bring it down to a practical level so that we can see how this works. Case number one, I've just tried to pick some very typical cases at different levels. These are actual cases that I have had. It was a child with a persistent cough. It had been going on for months. His mother was herself a homeopath, and she had tried many remedies. She had seen other homeopaths. She tried other different therapies, etc. But nothing seemed to work. And I was down in New Jersey one time giving a presentation, and she was in the audience, and she came up and presented this case to me. And so in asking her some questions, it was revealed that the cough basically was triggered by a particular event, and based on that, I gave one single remedy and the cough disappeared. Well, in this case, I didn't actually use homeopathy, which would be surprising to some people because supposedly I used a homeopathic remedy. And when we say homeopathic remedy, we generically mean a kind of energetic, dynamic remedy that comes in these little pilules or drops or whatever that say, homeopathic remedy on them. But the basis for giving the remedy was not a homeopathic basis. It was used using a different aspect, which we call Heilkunst, and I'll clarify that as we go along. So that's just one case where the case was solved not using homeopathy, but using Heilkunst. Case number two is a young mother, again an actual case with 3 active kids. She was, when she called me, immobilized on the sofa because she had a swollen knee, and the doctor had diagnosed this as rheumatoid arthritis. Of course, their solution for that is to give you a cortisone shot to shut down the inflammation, and then she's told that she'll just have to live with it and may have to have periodic cortisone shots through her life. Well, she didn't like that diagnosis, and she didn't like the prognosis that went with that. So somehow she found us, and in taking her case, basically, again, asked her one fundamental question, and as a result of that question, gave her one remedy, and her knee problem was resolved. So this supposed rheumatoid arthritis just disappeared. But I did tell her and warn her that at some point it could come back, because what was behind this had other causes, not just the one that I was treating for, that there was a kind of a series of causes or layers of causes, and that she would need to undergo a more systematic treatment, which she did. And during that treatment, the swollen knee returned temporarily as part of a healing process. And this happened twice. And since then, it's been gone. It's over 10 years, I think. Talked to her last a couple months ago, and it has not come back. I don't expect it will, because as far as I can tell, the underlying causation has been removed. So that's a case where Heilkunst was used and not homeopathy. And again, I'll clarify that later, but just want to make that clear. The third case, typical case, again, an actual case, was a woman in her 50s, had been suffering almost daily migraines for 30 years. I can't imagine what that was like. I used to suffer from migraines myself, but certainly not on a daily basis. She was on several drugs, which had some minor effect in terms of reducing the pain of the migraines. In taking her case, I told her that I could very likely get rid of her migraines, but it would take at least a year or more. Within 3 months, the migraines were 50% better, less frequent, less intense, 75% better, and gone within a year. Well, we had to continue the treatment for another year beyond that, just to make sure that they wouldn't come back, because again, in this case, there were still other underlying causations that could potentially bring this whole problem back up again. And what we're interested in is not just temporarily getting rid of the migraines, but permanently. Again, as far as I know from this lady, these migraines have never come back again. And this, again, is a case of using Heilkunst as opposed to homeopathy. Well, what do these three cases have in common? Basically, as I said earlier, I used homeopathic remedies, so-called homeopathic remedies, but I didn't use homeopathy. What I did use was Heilkunst. So we go back to our three questions. What is homeopathy? What is Heilkunst? And what exactly is the difference? Well, we'll just look at some basic elements that we need to understand in order to understand our three questions, or answer our three questions. Both Heilkunst and homeopathy were discovered by the same man, this famous Dr. Samuel Hahnemann, a German doctor who lived between 1755 and 1843. So that's one thing they have in common. The other thing that's important to note is that in his system, Heilkunst actually came first over homeopathy. And Heilkunst itself is a system that has two parts. One is treating what Dr. Hahnemann called primary diseases, and two, treating what he called secondary diseases. So he established this early on in his system, that there was a distinction between these two levels, or two kinds of diseases, and that is part of his whole system, which he called Heilkunst. He also established a principle. And he said, well, you have to treat these primary diseases first, and then you address any secondary diseases. That's logical. And he explained actually the logic as well, which is that the secondary diseases are produced from the primary diseases and depend on it. So if you can address the primary disease, the deeper, more important disease first, then often the secondary diseases disappear on their own. You don't have to treat them. So you get a 2-for-1 bargain in this case. But so his system, which he called Heilkunst, was established on the understanding of these two types of diseases, and also this principle that you treat the primary disease first. Now, homeopathy, or the homeopathic method, was invented by Dr. Hahnemann to treat the secondary diseases only. So homeopathy doesn't treat the primary diseases, it treats the secondary diseases. And remember that he said that you should treat the primary diseases first. So in that sense, homeopathy, as part of his whole system of Heilkunst, is actually a second best method of treating. So what do we use to treat the primary disease? Well, we could call it homeotonic or homotonic. Dr. Hahnemann never gave it an official name, but the idea behind it is very different from homeopathy. So here we have the distinction that the homeopathic method is dependent and based on symptomology. So in order to find a homeopathic remedy for the secondary diseases, you have to take the symptomology. Well, this is a second best method because symptoms are very complex, very confused, and in most people there's a whole host of symptoms from different diseases or conditions, and it makes it very difficult to distinguish the symptoms belonging to one condition versus the symptoms belonging to another condition, which explains why homeopathy in general terms in most chronic complex cases has a very low success rate. It works fairly well in simple cases, but beyond that it's not very successful. The homeotonic or homotonic method is not based on symptoms, it's based on causality. Very different. So we don't pay too much attention to the symptoms, which can be very fluctuating and confusing, but rather we try to identify the underlying causality behind a case. So if we look at these three cases, we look at the first case, the question that I asked was, when did the cough begin? Well, the answer was after witnessing his sister being hit by a car. His sister were playing in a park, and the sister ran after a ball, and a car hit her. And the cough started right after that. So this is not an example of, well, let's take the symptoms of the cough. Is it a barking cough? Is it a productive cough? Is it worse from this or better from that? Which, of course, all the homeopaths that, including the mother of this child, had tried to do and couldn't find the right remedy. Instead, the underlying cause of this case was fear. When we gave the remedy for fear, and there is basically one remedy for the primary disease known as fear, the cough was resolved. Very simple. Didn't have to pay attention to the symptomology. In case number 2, the so-called rheumatoid arthritic swollen knee, the question I asked her is, when did it start? What triggered it? And she was very clear about what had been the cause after a rotavirus vaccination. Well, here we have a clear case. It wasn't 100% certain, but it was fairly clear that the cause was this vaccination. And the remedy in this case was the remedy that we give for removing the shock of this particular vaccination. However, and that resolved that particular problem at that time, but as I mentioned earlier, the treatment was continued because there were other underlying causes that were, you could say, preceded the shock of the vaccination that were also contributing to the way that the body had responded. So it's like you could say it's almost like the straw that breaks the camel's back. You have a whole series of events that don't seem to cause any problem, and then you have one event, which is often referred to as never been well since event, that then seems to trigger this dramatic reaction on the part of the body. But all of these other previous shocks and traumas nonetheless contributed to the event itself. So we continue to remove in a sequential fashion, as we call it, that is working our way backwards chronologically through all these traumas that she had, various physical traumas, drugs, surgeries, emotional shocks and traumas, etc. And we also had to work our way back, in this case, through what we call inherited disease patterns, chronic miasms, which I'll talk a little bit more about towards the end. But by working our way systematically through this map, because we do have a map for all of this, we're not just kind of stumbling around in the dark, we're able to remove all of the contributing factors that had led to this so-called rheumatoid arthritic condition. In case number 3, the question I asked her was, what has happened to you since and before the migraine started? So in this case, we're dealing not only with a causality that triggered the migraine, but because it had been so chronic over all these years since the time when the migraines started, it's not a matter of what was going on before the migraine started, but also what has happened to you since, because all the things that have happened since in terms of stresses, shocks, and traumas were also contributing to maintaining the migraine problem. So this results in what we call a traumatic or dramatic timeline of events, shocks, and traumas. And here we have not only one or a few causes, we have multiple and cumulative causes, all of which needed to be removed. So just treating for one cause wasn't going to magically remove her migraines. But over time, as you saw, it started to reduce them to the point where after a year they were gone, but we continued treating to remove the known underlying causation so that they wouldn't come back again, because that is the objective, not just to remove it temporarily, but to get rid of it entirely. So that's where we continued to treat for the earlier shocks and traumas, as well as inherited disease patterns. So Heilkunst involves first, the treatment of all the primary diseases, the shocks and traumas. Now, these can be accidents, surgeries, emotional traumas, death in the family, death of a pet, divorce, all sorts of emotional events that you could imagine, as well as drugs, vaccinations, x-rays, injections, all the wonders of so-called modern medicine, all these interventions all have a certain cost involved, which is known as the iatrogenic disease. And we have, nature, poisons, insect bites, animal bites, a bite of a rabid dog, for example, etc. All of these things in different people, depending on your susceptibility, can potentially cause a problem. So we call all of these the list of usual suspects. So we don't know if any one of these events necessarily contributed to the problem, but like a good detective, we just round up all the usual suspects because we know that in many other cases, they have consistently been part of the problem. And then we also add to our map these inherited disease patterns or chronic miasms. Now, we have a map for those. We don't need you to identify those. That's a map that we have developed that pretty well is the same for everyone. The only thing that's different is the degree to which any given inherited disease pattern is affecting you. But by and large, everyone has these inherited disease patterns, and they need to be addressed in most cases these days, just because most cases are chronic complex cases. There are two types of inheritances. Of course, there's a genetic inheritance. Now, with Heilkunst, you can't do anything directly about the genetic inheritance if you have a mutation, for example. However, it is now known that you can indirectly affect genetic mutations. You can affect it both through what we call regimen, which is diet and exercise and nutrition, etc. But you can also affect it using energetic or so-called homeopathic remedies, and you can moderate the impact of any genetic mutation. The other type of inheritance is called epigenetic, and that is the type that we're addressing, that you can treat directly. These are certain tendencies, you can see it in families, towards heart disorder, nervous disorders, mental illness, etc. They're not necessarily grounded in any genetic defect or mutation, but actually is just a tendency that is passed down through the generations. But these can be addressed and removed. So the chronic miasms, as we call them, are these inherited epigenetic patterns. Now there's 8 of these patterns, and they're treated again in a specific sequence, which we've developed and worked out. And as I mentioned, we tend to have them all, so for most cases, we treat for them all. So, knowing all that, where does homeopathy fit in? Well, occasionally, during the sequential treatment for the primary diseases, that is, these underlying causations or shocks and traumas, as well as the inherited disease patterns, some of these secondary diseases may appear. It's like they're hiding in the background and they aren't removed by the treatment for the primary disease, so they may pop up. It doesn't happen very often, maybe in 10 to 15% of cases. They will pop up, and then we need to identify them through the symptom picture, because there's no known causation for them other than that they are related to one of the primary diseases. But since you've removed the primary disease and they're still there, you need to look at the symptomology. So that's when the homeopathic method or the homeopathic approach is used. So that basically, in a nutshell, tries to explain, from my perspective, the difference between Heilkunst and homeopathy. And the upshot of it is that Heilkunst is a much, much more effective approach to treatment initially than using homeopathy. From my knowledge and experience over the last 20, 25 years, I would say that with homeopathy, when you're dealing with most cases these days, which are chronic and complex, you might have a 10 or 15% success rate, which is why I gave it up many years ago, because I could see that it wasn't really addressing most of the serious cases. Whereas with Heilkunst, you have closer to an 85, 90% success rate, I would say. Even that, I think, is on the conservative side, but it's much, much more effective. So if people are interested or curious about the difference is that one is addressing Heilkunst, that is addressing the primary underlying causation, whereas homeopathy is really just addressing these secondary diseases, which are more at the surface, but doesn't get at the deeper underlying causation. So I'm just going to leave it here. I'm going to set it up so that you can download this particular file, so you can go through the slideshow, as it were, on your own. And then if you have any questions, just type them down below, and I'll get to them once I set up the download. Okay, so there you can download the file, and I'll just take a look and see if there's any questions here. What happens when the client doesn't know when symptoms started? Well, it doesn't matter if you don't have a clear idea. Basically, what we do is we start to ask questions about what has gone on in your life. You may not be clear about it, but if, for example, you had headaches starting and you can't remember exactly when they started, but you knew you had them around puberty or something, we would just start looking at all the things in your life that happened to you then. What kind of vaccinations did you receive? Did you have any surgeries? Did you have any emotional shocks or traumas? Maybe a family pet died, maybe your parents divorced, that kind of thing. So we don't need to know necessarily what the actual trigger was, because in most cases it's not really clear. The case I gave you of the young boy with the cough was a very simple and straightforward case, which I just used for illustrative purposes. But we basically just go and look at your whole life history and then start treating for it. Now, if we start treating for it and your problem disappears, you could stop and say, well, my problem's gone, I'll just stop treatment. But what can happen is if these other causations remain and have not been removed, a number of months, years, whatever down the road, the problem may come back again. So it's often good to continue and remove these causations, because even if they didn't cause your headache, they might later cause another problem. They're just like an accident waiting to happen, in a sense. We have done cease and are taking a break now. Is there a good time to start Heilkunst? Are they ever done concurrently? Well, cease is an approach that partially takes the idea of causation into account. They do treat for vaccination shock. They also use various remedies that they've identified that address various emotional disturbances. The difference there is that it's not done in what we call a kind of a sequential fashion. It's more based on how the particular case is responding. I have done quite a few cases where they had done cease therapy before, and it had some good results, but a lot of stuff remained, and that remains because the cease therapy is not really comprehensive at getting at the deeper underlying causation. But there's no incompatibility between them, although if you're working with one, it's probably better to just continue with that until you get as far as you can get with it, and then to start Heilkunst. But there's no good or bad time to start Heilkunst. You can do that at any time, basically. What about complex diseases like multiple sclerosis, where there are a number of different potential triggers? Yes, the certain conditions are very problematic for a number of reasons. One is because of what we call tissue damage. In some cases, the tissue damage is fairly extensive, which means that even though you remove the underlying causation or triggers behind the condition, the body may not be fully able to recover. There's a limit to the extent to which tissue damage can be restored. Now, when I say there's a limit, that doesn't mean it can't be restored. I've seen a lot of cases where the doctors have said nothing could be accomplished, the condition could not be improved, and by working with Heilkunst, we were able to make quite substantial improvements that no one thought possible. But I also have to recognize that there are limits. I have a patient currently, for example, who has muscular dystrophy, which is a degenerative nerve disorder, which has many and deep causes. And in most of those cases, by the time the patient comes to you, there's a lot of damage that's been done. But it is quite remarkable what improvements can be achieved in those kinds of cases, because the drugs that they use just generally make things worse. Although they seem to manage the symptoms, they actually undermine the overall case, and things just kind of go from bad to worse. That's my experience. So there is a lot that can be done, but also have to caution that in many of these serious cases, there is a limit to what can be done. How is Heilkunst different from low-dose immunotherapy allergy? Well, the difference is in the following, is if you have an allergy, the question is, from a Heilkunst perspective, the question is, why do you have the allergy? And so then we would look and say maybe, well, maybe there's this emotional shock. Maybe you received such an emotional shock that as a result of that, your body overreacted and just happened to overreact in a way that caused an allergy to a particular substance you were eating at the time. And therefore, there's a kind of an underlying association in by your immune system between this particular substance and a threat on your life or your integrity. Whereas with low-dose immunotherapy allergy, the idea behind it is to take the allergy and see if you can moderate it by providing, in a sense, you could say a homeopathic approach. You would provide a dose of the allergen to try to desensitize. And that can be effective up to a point, but the key point here is that it doesn't remove the causation for the allergy. My approach would be preferably to address why do you have the allergy in the first place, as opposed to simply trying to moderate the allergy. In very simple cases of allergic reactions, it can make the allergic reaction go away, but that doesn't mean that you've removed the underlying causation. So many people find years later that the allergy will come back because the underlying causation itself has not been removed. Now, we can, in our treatment approach, we can provide people with remedies that work on an acute basis similar to the low-dose immunotherapy approach, so that it moderates the allergy. If you have hay fever, or you have fall or spring allergies, we provide remedies to moderate those in the short term. But our real objective in the long term is to get rid of the underlying causation so these things disappear, and that you don't need any remedies on a periodic basis to kind of keep these things under control. Typically speaking, how many rounds of miasms do you recommend for ASD kiddos? Well, again, I can only give you averages. The thing I want to emphasize the most here is that every case is unique. Although there are features of every case that are common and typical, every child is unique, and it's very difficult to give a precise answer. But if I'm speaking in very general terms, for most ASD children, you have to do at least 4 rounds. And it's unfortunate for me to have to say this, but as these cases continue over the years to grow in number, these cases are actually getting worse, not better. I don't mean the ones we're treating, but the ones that we haven't treated. As we see these cases over the years coming to us, they tend to be more serious than they were 5-10 years ago, because of the increased vaccination, the increased problems with toxicity, the increased stress from our modern lifestyle. So unfortunately, sometimes you have to go beyond the 4. There are potentially about 8, I'd say, rounds that you could do at the chronic miasm level. And I have a number of cases, maybe about 10 or 15, 20% of cases where I have to go 5, 6, 7 rounds. Can you get rid of Epstein-Barr? Yes, you can. Again, the name Epstein-Barr is a name that hides a lot of individuality, because the underlying causation for Epstein-Barr condition in one case will be somewhat different from another case. But from my experience, yes, there is no reason why you can't remove Epstein-Barr using the Heilkunst approach. How is homotoxicology different from CEASE? Well, homotoxicology is an approach that uses various so-called homeopathic remedies or energetic remedies. It's a combination of classic homeopathic remedies, organ remedies, and various, you could say what we call isodes, to address the issue of toxicity in the body. So to help promote the removal of toxicity. Very valuable, and we do use the homotoxicological approach within the overall treatment. I'm just focusing more on the, you could say, the removal of underlying causation, but the aspect of detoxification is a very important one that we address as well in our overall practice. Okay, I don't know if I've addressed all of the questions. I think I did. I don't see any that I missed. Were there any other questions at this point? Do you believe peanut allergies these days are from vaccinations? If so, and it is deemed the reason, can it be fixed? Well, the problem we face with anything, including, for example, autism or ASD, spectrum disorders, is that the underlying causation is multiple. So it'd be a mistake to say, well, autism is caused by vaccination. Yes, that's true at one level, but another level, I have cases where children who are autistic have not received any vaccination. So there are many types of causation that can contribute to a given condition. So the same with peanut allergies. Yes, any kind of allergy is the result of an immune system that basically has run amok, that is overreactive, oversensitive, and sees things that are just normal aspects to a healthy person as being a threat to survival. And so you get this overreaction, which becomes a threat to the integrity of the system. Peanuts started to become a problem basically when chemicals started to be used. Synthetic chemicals began to be used in the 50s. You know, if you remember the slogan, DuPont Corporation, better living through chemistry. And so we lived this experiment for the last 50, 60 years or more of exactly what this better living through chemistry involves. At one level, at a material level, it's made our life a lot better, but at another level, it has created a lot of problems. And because of all of these chemicals, the body becomes more sensitive, the immune system becomes more sensitive, and things that never used to be a problem before suddenly become allergies, and to the point where if they are things like peanuts, it's not so much the peanuts that you're allergic to, but the aflatoxin that is on the peanut, because the peanut's not actually a nut. It grows under the ground, and it has a lot of mold on it. And mold is probably one of the greatest threats to the integrity of the body. So the body has a very intense reaction to mold of any form. You look at people who move into houses that have black mold or white mold or whatever, you can have very strong reactions to that. But the vaccinations in terms of sensitizing or oversensitizing the body's immune system will contribute to a much stronger reaction to the aflatoxins that are related to peanuts. Whereas in the past, the body would have had a kind of reaction, but it would not have been noticed that much, or it would have been seen as just having a bit of a cold or the sniffles or something, or some vague allergy suddenly can become deadly. Peanut allergies are not easy to treat, even with Heilkunst, because the underlying causation can be very deep. However, from my experience, you can bring most of these kinds of life-threatening allergies, these anaphylactic types of reactions, down to a level where they are not life-threatening anymore, and they can, be at a point where you just have these normal eruptions, reactions, which are still not desirable or pleasant, but it brings it down from life-threatening. Now, again, every case is a bit unique here, and some of the causation can go very, very deep. So in that sense, you have to treat each case somewhat differently. Is there any interaction with pharmaceutical meds? No. Well, I shouldn't say no. Yes, in the sense that the pharmaceutical meds tend to act as a brake on the body's healing reaction. The pharmaceutical medications are actually designed to shut down or poison, actually, various metabolic pathways in order to stop certain symptoms. So that in that sense, it's a bit like driving down the highway in your car at 50, 60 miles an hour with your foot out lightly on the brake. You're going to slow things down a bit and create a bit more wear and tear, but that doesn't stop the car from moving. We have a lot of cases of children and adults on fairly heavy drugs, and we can still successfully treat them. It just makes it a little more difficult, takes a little bit longer, but it doesn't stop the treatment, and there's certainly nothing that the homeopathic remedy does that in any way interferes or interacts with the medication. So if you're on some kind of heart medication or antidepressant or antibiotic, it's not going to stop any benefit that you might be getting from that medication, but it will, it will continue the removal of the underlying causation that caused the problem you're trying to treat with the meds in the first place. We also can supply energetic remedies or so-called homeopathic remedies to moderate any side effects of the medication that you're on while you have to be on it, so that it doesn't continue to undermine your health, but you can still benefit from the temporary relief that the medication is giving. Okay, are there any other questions at this point, or? Well, if there are no further questions at this stage, I'll just reiterate. Oh, I see someone is typing. Let me just, okay. I'll just reiterate my thanks for inviting me to talk to you about this. It's a topic I feel very strongly about in terms of the option that people have, not on the one hand through the conventional system to simply suppress your symptomology and continue to suffer not only the effects of the problem, but the added effects of the the iatrogenic disease that's being caused by the drugs. But you have other safe options that are highly effective, and these may involve so-called homeopathic remedies, but Heilkunst is a much more comprehensive, much more effective approach than just homeopathy in its generally understood sense. So a lot of people have tried homeopathy. I know who've come to us have tried homeopathy with some results, but generally speaking, it does not address very effectively most chronic complex cases. Whereas with the Heilkunst approach, although it does take time because these cases are chronic and complex, they're not simple cases, the results are very, very satisfying, certainly from our experience. Missed the beginning. Did you mention if we can connect with you? I did not mention that. I could provide the, I'll just type the the address that you can, the clinic address. If you have further questions, Jason can help you with, or Francis. If you want, we do offer, if people still have a lot of questions and aren't sure yet, we do offer a kind of free initial small consultation just to answer your questions, explain more while you're trying to make up your mind, so we don't charge you for that. I certainly want people to make the decision to be treated, you know, having all their questions answered. I certainly would want all my questions answered before I decided to try a particular approach. So if you are interested, but you still have lots more questions you'd like to ask personally to take into account, and just talk to Jason about setting up a complimentary time for us to talk, and we can pursue that individually. Do you think parents should be treated or need to be treated at the same time as a child? Well, in an ideal world, yes. Certainly, parents, in particular the moms, because they tend to be responsible for the health decisions of the family, probably should be treated first. I know that sounds terrible, but the analogy I always use is that if you're on an airplane and they talk about the oxygen mask coming down, they don't tell you to put the oxygen mask on the child first. They tell you to put the oxygen mask on yourself and then on your child. So in an ideal world, you should probably be treated first, then your child. However, that's not the way generally things work, but it is very beneficial. And I think if you talk to moms who have been treated, they find that it was certainly worthwhile. It makes your process of interacting with the child so much better, and also your health is so much better. But your child's emotional state is very linked to your emotional state. So if you're under a lot of fear and grief and anger and other issues resulting from what you've been through or what your child has been through, the children are going to pick that up one way or the other. So it does definitely help treatment. Now, it's not required. Your child can still get healthy even though you aren't treated, but it certainly would be desirable if that was possible. Is treatment ever covered by insurance? That would depend on what kind of insurance you have. In a general sense, it probably is not. Not much of the so-called alternative health is covered by insurance, but some people do have private insurance programs that cover so-called naturopathic treatment or massage or other things, and often they will get that covered, our treatment covered. We try to make our treatment as affordable as possible and still allow us to offer it. We do provide family discounts, so if you want to be treated yourself with your child and you have another child, I do have a lot of families that get treated. We try to provide fairly significant discounts for any additional people being added to the family plan, as it were, in order to, so you don't have to make hard choices as to which of your children are going to be treated, if you would like them all to be treated. Yes, thank you, Melissa. In our view, yes, it is definitely cheap. I've had people come to me who have spent upwards of $100,000, $150,000 or more trying to have their child, their autistic child, for example, treated, and without any real results. If you look at our system, it's maybe $2,000 to $3,000 a year, depending on various factors, and that's maybe a couple of years of treatment. And yet the results from that are far superior, certainly in my experience, from all the cases I've seen over the years, and that's been thousands, is far greater. And also the thing to keep in mind is that we don't charge for the remedies that we send out. The fee that you pay is just for the consultation fee, but any remedies that come out of that consultation that are sent to you are part of that fee. So you're not going to be charged individually for remedies that we send out to you, other than the cost of mailing them to you. But generally speaking, it's a one fee covers both the consultation itself plus the remedies that are sent out. I see one more person is typing, so I'll just wait for that. Are you generally able to estimate how long treatment is for a patient? Yes, again, I have to say that every case is different, but in general terms, these days, you're looking at 1 to 2 years for your average case. It could be 2 to 3 years for more complex cases, particularly cases involving autism or people like children on the spectrum. But in terms of when you start to notice improvements, the average tends to be within 3 to 6 months at the most. People already start to see signs of improvement and, get a sense that the case is moving in the right direction and are generally very happy with the progress. But to actually get to the deep-seated changes and the removal of the underlying causation, that can take longer, depending on the timeline. Depends on how old you are, depends on how many shocks and traumas you have had in your life, etc. Some cases are very complex that way, others are much simpler. The other thing is that you're not obligated, as it were, to continue treatment. If you get to a point where everything seems to be better from your perspective, you can stop. But what we often will tell you is that if, in our view, there are still underlying causations, there's kind of a caution that issues may resurface down the road at some point because you don't you can. Okay, I'm back, hopefully. Can you hear me now? Yes, okay, sorry. The internet connection just faltered there and temporarily cut me off and then cut off my microphone as well. So I was just saying that basically we've recorded this session so that you can go back and listen to it again at your leisure and ponder the points. And if you have further questions, then as Melissa indicated on your little Facebook chat group, if you want a further session to go into aspects in more detail once you've looked at this, or to ask more specific questions about various conditions, etc., we can certainly do that. And you're also welcome to contact the clinic if you're interested and get more information about our approach. Yes, our clinic is located, or the clinic office is located in Canada, but basically we treat people around the world. So we're doing the treatment via Skype and telephone. So we can treat anyone. We have people in Australia, China, Japan, Singapore, United States, Canada, Europe, etc., almost anywhere. This makes it effective and affordable, so you don't have to travel. That's another good aspect of Heilkunst treatment, is it can be done at a distance. It's not dependent on seeing the child, although we can do that via Skype video if we need to. But most of this treatment is very readily done over Skype. We even have, when cases are moving along very easily, we even have what we call an email consultation, which makes it a lot cheaper for you. You just send in a report on what's happening, and we assess that, and based on that, send out the next remedies, so that most of the cases, after a certain period of time, really settle down, and there's very little drama or difficulty, and you're comfortable with the process. So that means that they can be done via emails, and then if we have to, we can skip to a Skype consultation or phone consultation to deal with something that might be a little more complex or complicated at some point. But most cases generally move along the way they're supposed to without a lot of difficulty. Okay, so we'll stop there. I'm going to stop the recording, and then I'll leave the session open in case anyone hasn't had a chance to download the file, and then just come back and close it. But as I say, the recording will be available. Jason will make it available to all those who attended, and you can certainly share this with anyone else you want to. It's not restricted to any particular group. Feel free to share with your friends, and to say, if you want to do this again in the future, I'm more than happy to do that. And thank you for attending and persisting this long in listening and asking questions.